slaves in ancient Greek society weren't allowed to go to the gym. Friendship is so heavily discouraged in the modern world, especially by liberals. Why do we believe that actually physical cultivation is separate from mental and moral cultivation? There's really been an attempt to minimize testosterone decline and just to say that it doesn't really matter, you know. The kind of system of modern kind of liberal consumerism works basically on people being passive consumers. And
okay, on the show today, a writer and health campaigner. So we can now call him Charles because he's been doxxed not long ago, which means he used to write in secret, but now he's out in the open, as it were, which is great because we can interview him. You can see him on camera. Really interesting guy. He's got a new book out about the last men or coming out. He's also written a cookbook. And there's not many people who Wikipedia would call a far-right conspiracy theorist who's written a cookbook. This is a sort of strange combination, and maybe we'll explore this. He's also got a PhD from Oxford University, so he's no fool. This guy knows his stuff. Really makes the connection between food and politics in a way I haven't heard other people do. I think that's sort of one of his main areas. And he was on Tucker Carlson about the end of men, so maybe we'll talk about testosterone levels as well. So Raw Egg Nationalist, the expert in his field. Charles, welcome.
It's an absolute pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
I'm wondering how many egg puns I can get in this excellent interview. Now you're out of your shell. So let's start with a nice neutral question. People who lift weights are morally superior to people who don't. Why?
Well, okay, here's something to think about. Why were gym bros during the pandemic one of the main demographics who resisted all of the social restrictions, the lockdown measures, who spoke out most vocally against basically the medical tyranny that was established? So, yeah, I mean, why was that? What is it about lifting weights? What is it about taking your health and your life in your hands, having a vision for yourself for the future, taking responsibility? What is it about that actually makes, you know, a gym bro, a meathead, somebody who spends a lot of time in the gym, somebody who might otherwise look down your nose at perhaps, and a lot of people do look down their nose at gym heads and gym bros and think they're stupid, it's brawn, no brain, etc. Why were those people actually at the forefront of resisting everything that happened? Why did they keep their gyms open? Why did they say, you know, it's necessary for us to have access to gyms. It's necessary for us to be able to do the things that not only, make us feel good, but actually protect us against this virus. And so I mean, I think actually really fundamentally, you could turn that question on its head and you could actually say, look, like, why as a society do we believe actually that health and fitness are ephemeral, that they don't matter? Why don't we believe, like the ancients did, that you have a sound mind and a sound body? Why do we separate these two things? And why do we believe that actually physical cultivation is separate from mental and moral cultivation? So that's how I would turn it around, and I would say, actually, look, why are we even asking this question in the first place? Because it's not, I don't think it's actually a natural question. I think that we're the weird ones actually asking questions like that.
Yeah, the Greeks who invented the word gymnasium would have found it a strange question. They would say, of course you cultivate virtue in the gym. The samurai, I have a Japanese martial arts background, would say, of course you cultivate Budo ethics, the way of being Japanese through Budo, through working with martial arts. The Victorians even who invented our modern sports, the modern sports of football and rugby, they were invented as character building activities.
Yeah, so the playing fields of Eton. Yeah.
Yes, Waterloo was one on the fields of Eton. The idea was it was developing a sort of officer class of people. I mean, to your rhetorical question there, a one-word answer might be agency. It builds an embodied sense of agency. And I also noticed that PTs responded very creatively. They weren't passive during that period of time.
No, no, it was very noticeable. It was very noticeable. But also, you just had these gym bros, gym owners who just said, no, I'm not closing my business down. I'm not going to prevent people from continuing to fortify their bodies. And so yeah, so good luck with that. And you know, there were some very high profile cases. There were high profile cases in the UK, in the US, in Canada, around the world. But I mean, you know, you mentioned the ancient Greeks. You know, um, slaves in ancient Greek society weren't allowed to go to the gym. And that was because the ancient Greeks recognized that going to the gym was essential for a man to cultivate something known as thymos, which is basically it's a Greek word basically for spiritedness, you could say. It's a kind of thrusting, kind of you could call it like a kind of sort of sense of masculine purpose, virtue. Political virtue is built on a basis of thymos. Plato would say, you know. So the ancient Greeks knew that actually, you know, if you physically cultivate yourself in the gym, you're also cultivating virtue. You're cultivating desirable attributes that are kind of like necessary for the functioning of society. They're necessary for the protection of society and the upholding of a particular society's values. And so, actually, if you are a slave society, you know, you don't want the slaves to get ideas above their station. And so, what's interesting, I suppose, is the analogy with ancient Greece, is saying, you know, like we're being told we all, you know, we're not allowed to exercise during the pandemic. I mean, are we basically, or were we basically, like, you know, in the position of the ancient slaves in Athenian society or whatever? And you know, it's noticeable, it's very, very noticeable, for instance, in Aristotle's Politics, um, that he talks about, you know, he talks about tyranny at length. And he says, you know, what do tyrants do? Well, tyrants prevent men from associating with one another. They close down the voluntary societies. They turn men against each other. And the gymnasia were essential parts of the social and political life in
Yes.
ancient Athens and the other Greek cities. That was where men not only went there just to lift weights and do exercise, they went there to talk, to do business, to listen to lectures. You know, I mean, these were institutions actually that were far more kind of comprehensive and rounded than the gym that as we would understand it today.
Right, right. You'll
Um,
still see that in the banyo. I've spent a lot of time in Russia and
yes,
Ukraine, and you'll still see that, the sort of guys
yes,
doing business in the banyo. And, you
mm,
know, I remember I was in the top banyo in Moscow, and I was told it was a third gangsters, a third politicians, and a third business millionaires, and they're kind of the same people. And
funny. Yeah, I
one of
bet.
the, it's interesting also the word bro. So you were talking about
Mm,
gym bro. It's become an insult, gym bro,
it has.
tech bro, right wing bro, whatever. I mean, that relates to the fact that it does seem that it's quite threatening to someone that men should, particularly young men, particularly young fit men, should
Mm,
freely associate. Why is that a
yeah.
scary idea to some people? It seems like the most natural thing in the world, brotherhood, surely.
Yeah, well, I think maybe a better word for it is friendship, male friendship. So I was in, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was in a documentary, a Tucker Carlson documentary called The End of Men in 2022 about testosterone decline. I was actually one of the main stars of this of the documentary, along with RFK Jr., you know, who is now head of Health and Human Services. You know, I mean, he's taken on a huge, huge role in this Make America Healthy Again agenda. That's a central kind of plank of Trump 2.0. But the documentary was about testosterone decline primarily, about the precipitous decline in testosterone levels that's taken place across the developed world since we've been measuring testosterone, certainly sort of 50, 70, maybe even 100 years, testosterone decline has been taking place at a level of something like 1% a year. I mean, it's precipitous and it's part of a broader reproductive decline, sperm counts in particular. Sperm counts are plummeting. It's all kind of wrapped up together. But the first part of the documentary was about the nature of the problem and the causes, exposure to harmful chemicals, endocrine disruptors. Those are hormone disrupting chemicals. So they're basically in everything: personal care products, food, the water, the air. They're everywhere. Microplastics, PFAS, phthalates, BPA, all this kind of stuff. But then the second part of the documentary was about me and about people like me, so-called right-wing bodybuilders who are kind of bucking the trend, kicking against the pricks, and trying to do something about testosterone decline, about the the kind of pervasive toxicity of the modern world, and working out, uh, eating animal food diets, doing all sorts of crazy stuff,
Crazy far
sunning.
right ideas like
Yes,
being outside and eating eggs and going to the gym,
yeah,
right?
and hanging out, surrounding yourself with other like-minded men who encourage you to be better, not to be a passive consumer, all this kind of stuff. And what was very interesting about the documentary actually was the reaction from the liberal media. So there was a trailer that dropped in, I think it was April of 2022, and then the documentary was September or October. But when the trailer dropped, I mean, it broke the internet for about, like 15 minutes. I mean, it really did. And all these liberal commentators in the US, Joy Behar, George Takei, Stephen Colbert, they were all talking about this trailer and saying, "Oh, it's incredibly gay. It's so homoerotic. All of these ideas. It's gay fascism. It's Tucker Carlson's kind of repressed sexuality coming out. It's all this kind of stuff." And actually, it's very interesting the way that this kind of homosexual slur is
Mm,
used when men get together to do stuff. So
right.
there's a very famous essay or series of essays by C.S. Lewis called Four Types of Love, where he talks about, among other things, friendship as one of four types of love. And there's this devastating, devastating quote where he says, I can't remember the exact words, but he says something like, "Those who confuse friendship with eros, i.e., sexual love, betray the fact that they have never had a real friend themselves." This was written in the 1940s, right? And C.S. Lewis is saying, look, you're making a mistake if you think that male friends are all secretly gay. Well, so I mean, it's a slur that's been used for a long time, and it has very specific effects. It's intended to discourage men from associating with
Yes.
one another. It's intended to make men retreat from each other. And so what do you end up with? Well, you end up with these kind of like really sad last kind of holdouts of masculinity, like the man cave, where this kind of isolated man, husband probably with kids, goes to his man cave and sits and plays video games, and it's like that's the one last space that he's got to be a man.
Mm.
um so I mean, I actually wrote an essay about this in American Mind, a journal, Claremont Institute, about how this slur is used and why it's used. And I do think it is used very deliberately to deter men from associating with one another, because people understand actually that male friendship is a revolutionary force, or it certainly can be.
Yes.
When men who are bound together by a kind of shared code, by loyalty, by a shared sense of honor, uh, striving towards some particular goal, that could be that can flip a society on its head. I mean, there's actually no limit to what groups of determined
Mm, mm.
men can do together. And I do think that it is actually, yes, it is actually seen as a kind of revolutionary threat. I think that the system works, the kind of system of modern kind of liberal consumerism works basically on people being passive consumers, and men who take control of their lives, who don't just eat processed food and watch pornography and sit in all day watching Netflix and Star Wars films, and actually take control of their lives. And they're not passive consumers anymore. They don't just receive values. They're actually projecting their values out onto the world and potentially changing things.
Yes.
So I think yeah, I mean, I think that I think these people, whether they know it or not, explicitly, they sense the threat. They sense the
Yeah, yeah.
threat that actually men who aren't these, like passive losers, are a potentially a threat to the system. So that's why I think brotherhood, but to give it its proper name, friendship, is so heavily discouraged in the modern world, especially by liberals.
Yes, yeah, and it doesn't have to be conspiratorial. It can be sort of
No.
an instinct against it, a
Mm.
dislike, or in action. So, for example, testosterone levels, to return to that, 1% doesn't sound like much, but cumulatively, I've heard you say in other interviews that means that, in a very short number of years, the mean sperm count will be zero. So this is an
Yes,
existential threat to humanity. There is
it is.
a sperm-shaped meteor heading towards the planet, right? There's a literally a humanity-ending threat, but because it's masculine, we're sort of okay with it. Like if instead everyone's testosterone was going too high to reproduce,
Mm. Yeah,
something would be done pretty fucking quickly, I think. If it was like, oh,
yeah.
men's testosterone's doubled in the last 20 years, this is going to
Mm.
be, because obviously, too high testosterone may cause issues as well, in certain parts of the population. Women are no longer able to reproduce because their testosterone's too
Mm.
high or whatever. So, I mean, if that was the case, something would just be done. But we're sort of okay as a society with
Yeah.
men disappearing. So it doesn't have to be conspiratorial. It can just be
No.
inaction, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's an interesting thing, It turns out that basically all industrial chemicals, all herbicides, all pesticides, all of these chemicals that are in personal care products that we're exposed to on a daily basis that are affecting our hormone levels. Unfortunately, it turns out that all of them seem to be, or most of them, the vast majority, seem to be estrogenic. That's just a fact. That isn't, nobody's done that on purpose. It just seems to be the case that, all plasticizers, all herbicides, pesticides, whatever, they mimic the effects of the female hormone estrogen in the body. And so they have uh, you might say like masculinity sapping consequences. They also have very negative consequences for women as well, and that's something that absolutely shouldn't be minimized. Excess of estrogen is bad for women too. It's very bad, in fact, and it's just as dangerous to female health, to female fertility as it is to male fertility. You have to have a specific ratio of testosterone to estrogen if you're a woman or a man, and anything that really seriously unbalances that will affect your health. But yes, I mean it's an interesting kink of the modern world that actually all of these chemicals are estrogenic. And I've said, like you just said, I think things would be very, very different if all of these chemicals were actually androgenic and they were making men more aggressive, more assertive, you know, getting men up off the sofa rather than making them sit down. It would the problem wouldn't have been allowed to get, I think, to this stage if actually, one of the kind of intrinsic effects of the modern industrial world was to make men less passive, more thrusting, etc. But as it happens, it's the opposite, and I think that kind of chemical assault on our bodies, just from a systemic perspective, it tends to the maintenance of the system rather than to challenging it. So nothing
Hmm. Hmm.
happens, of course.
Hmm. And I've seen this go through the normal cycle of it's not happening, you're silly to talk about it. You're just a
Mm.
right-wing conspiracy nut. You want big muscles or some gay thing.
Yeah,
To, oh, it is happening, but actually it's a good thing.
yeah.
I've heard you talk elsewhere. The Democratic Convention was saying that men need to be more feminized, and maybe let's bring in
I
the politics here. And
yeah, I
usually the
was.
first stage is happening. It's a good thing, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Mm.
I've seen the exact same cycles with conversations about immigration over the years, right?
Oh,
Like
sure.
it's a conspiracy theory. Okay, it's not really a
Mm.
theory; it's a fact. But there's nothing we can do about it. So
Mm.
let's make that link now then between
Yeah.
the chemical state we're in and the politics
Mm.
that we have.
Yeah, of
Someone might say,
course.
what on earth has testosterone got to do with politics? What would be your starting place there?
Well, okay. Well, let's make some observations. So yes, like you were saying, for the longest period of time, so for years, decades, um, uh, there's really been an attempt to minimize testosterone decline and just to say that it doesn't really matter, So it's not a problem. Male testosterone is declining, yeah, whatever, doesn't mean anything. And in fact, actually, that was in 2022 in response to the Tucker Carlson documentary. That was actually one of the main responses from the liberal mainstream, was just to say, well, this isn't a political issue at all. I mean, if it's happening, so what? Well, 2 years later, at the Democrat National Convention, when you've got Kamala Harris and her Vice President Tim Walz going up against Donald Trump and JD Vance, and you'd had the Republican National Convention where Hulk Hogan comes on stage rips his t-shirt off to reveal a Trump Vance t-shirt and says, let Trumpomania run wild. And it's like something from, it's like something from classic 1980s WWF. Like it's just insane, over the top kind of action hero aesthetics. So what do you get at the Democrat National Convention? Well, Planned Parenthood took a mobile vasectomy clinic to the National Convention, parked it outside, and offered free vasectomies to any men in attendance who wanted them. I mean, it's so
Wow.
incredible. It's so incredibly on the nose. You actually couldn't make
It's
that up.
it's not subtle. When I heard
No.
that previously, and I was like, no. And I
Yeah.
also didn't it double as an abortion clinic on the
Yes. So
alternative
so
days.
so one day it was a male sterility clinic, and the next day it was a female sterility clinic. I mean, it's pretty clear messaging. And there was also right outside the front of the convention, there was a giant IUD. There was a huge interuterine device statue that was put up. I think it was inflatable or something. So I mean the messaging was very much about not reproducing,
Right.
about being sterile. But then in the hall, you had people saying, testosterone. We're not appealing to high testosterone men. We're after a different kind of demographic. We're the party for men who are happy with testosterone decline. We're the party of sensitive men like Tim Walz. Tim Walz is happy to let a woman lead him. Tim Walz is confident
He
enough in
was
his
he
masculinity.
just for listeners who aren't so political or not following America, he was Kamala's number two, right? The
Yes.
vice guy. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's the governor of Minnesota, and I mean he was wheeled out as this like bizarre kind of like goofy uncle kind of candidate. He'd jump on the stage and start kind of pogoing and stuff,
So
and
obedient men are okay. Like silly or obedient men
yeah,
are okay. We're allowed to be obedient. And this is sort of, I mean, if we look at it psychology, a lot of our listeners aren't so political, but they're really interested in psychology.
mm,
And I've followed a few YouTubers who have transitioned. Whatever I think of that
mm,
is another thing, but it's very interesting that
yes,
when the women start taking testosterone,
mm,
they often report quite serious changes psychologically in terms of their
mm-hmm,
perception, in terms of their
mm-hmm,
relationship, their boyfriend or girlfriend. And
yeah,
this is a very clear experiment. And these people are not, these generally are politically pretty left. But as soon as
yes.
they just chemically, they inject themselves with testosterone, there's quite a lot of very interesting reports. So the effect of testosterone isn't just muscle building, right? In terms of like
No, well,
honesty and all sorts of
mm,
things.
yeah, well, look, I mean, look, what you have to understand is that virtually every single cell in your body has hormone receptors. So testosterone has effects, estrogen has effects on pretty much every single cell in your body. Brain tissue, muscle tissue, fat tissue, organ tissue. Um, you know, these hormones don't just estrogen doesn't just give you breasts. I mean, estrogen affects your brain. Testosterone affects your brain. It doesn't just affect your balls. I mean, I mean, you have to understand. I mean, hormones are people aren't their hormones. You're not just your hormones, but your
Sure.
hormones determine huge portions of your behavior and provide the kind of structure for it and structure for physical development, including the development of the brain. Um, and there are some very interesting studies, and I talk about these actually at length in my new book, The Last Men: Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, which is out next month, which is basically a follow-on from The End of Men, the Tucker Carlson documentary I was in. There are loads and loads of studies that show actually the effects of testosterone on behavior, and also some studies that suggest very particular, let's say, like political associations with the hormones. So, I mean, there was one study that was done, for instance, that showed that actually, if you give Democrats a shot of exogenous testosterone, it's usually actually given as a gel. So, you rub some testosterone gel on the arm. Democrats become more favorable towards Republican political candidates.
I did a video on Mark Zuckerberg. He started lifting weights and doing
Yep.
MMA, and he looked
Mm,
physically, he just transformed. But he also seemed
yep.
to have, I mean, some of this I could cynically say was he saw the way the wind was blowing, but
Mm,
some of it seemed genuine. Like he seemed
mm.
to have had a genuine change of view on
Sa-
various things.
same things happened to Jeff Bezos as well, actually.
Okay. He
I mean,
did
he's
TRT.
probably, yeah, he's on TRT for sure. and he's starting to he's not only more muscular physically, but also his politics is more muscular. And he famously, during the election campaign, prevented the Washington Post from explicitly endorsing Kamala Harris. I mean, again, I think that he knew which way the wind was blowing. I mean, he is the founder of Amazon. He's got huge amounts of customer behavioral data that is an incredible predictor of political beliefs and voting preferences and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's that, and that's the same with Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook. I mean, they knew which way the wind was blowing, and actually people should have paid more attention to their behavior during the political campaign
because they've got the data, right? They're seeing data the rest of us can only dream of in terms of
Yeah, I
predicting
mean,
trends.
don't trust polls. I mean, there's no political poll that can compete with the kind of data that Zuckerberg and Bezos and all of these other tech guys have. But yeah, so there's that study that I talked about with the testosterone administration. I think it was called something like testosterone administration induces a red shift in left-leaning people, something like that. But there are other studies that associate testosterone levels with things like in-group preference. So that's your preference. It's like basically your preference for your own tribe, right? And that
Yes.
is fundamentally, that is, I think, a distinguisher between left and right. Left and right have very different attitudes towards their tribe, i.e., who is in the tribe,
Yes.
who is included within the boundaries of moral consideration, etc. Like the circle is much narrower, I would say, for a right-wing person. They're more inclined to want to keep, let's say, like altruism within the boundaries of a local community, a nation, and maybe no further. Whereas, leftists are more apt to consider, like the whole of mankind within their moral consideration, etc. So that's in-group preference. There's also parochial altruism as well. So they've done studies that show that men with higher testosterone are more likely to be generous to people within their in-group than their out-group. So there are all of these studies like that actually you can patch together and you start to see, well, actually, maybe the difference between left and right, or one difference between left and right, certainly between males, is testosterone levels.
And this shouldn't be news for a lot of the female listeners, in that a lot of the
No.
female listeners who are particularly embodiment coaches, people who listen, they're into cycles in a big way and they track their cycles. A lot of female embodiment work around this. And, my girlfriend, for example, will say, I'm definitely better boundary during this part of my cycle, and I'm more no, and I'm more open and more agreeable during this part of my cycle. And for her, that's a very obvious thing as a woman, that her hormones are affecting whether she goes along with things, whether she agrees to things, how agreeable she is. I think that's very obvious to most women who have that cyclical nature. So it shouldn't really be a surprise. Plus the sort of trans information.
But what's interesting though about that then, of course, is that hundreds of millions of women worldwide are now on the contraceptive pill, and it's common to give women the contraceptive pill when they're girls. I mean, teenage girls get given the contraceptive pill as a matter of course when they're 13, 14, sometimes, just for acne, but also just for, let's say, like protective purposes, because they're going to be, meeting boys, etc., and doing what teenage boys and teenage girls do when they meet up. Um, uh, so actually, I think a lot of women now don't understand that cycle. They don't feel that cycle. And what actually happens is they're caught in a particular phase of the cycle. It's the luteal phase, I think, of the cycle. And that has very particular psychological effects. So, we know that there are studies or there are studies that show us that, for example, women have different sexual preferences on and off the contraceptive pill.
Yes.
So anecdotally, this is true, but there's also research, like in a stable, if a man and a woman are in a stable relationship and the woman was on the pill when they met, if she comes off the pill, she'll often stop fancying her boyfriend and break up with him. That's actually a thing because sexual preferences change during different phases of the cycle. And so during one phase of the cycle, a woman, when she's when she's ovulating, etc., then I think she prefers men who are classically more masculine, i.e., have more testosterone. Whereas if she's in the non-ovulating phase of the cycle, then actually it's the preference is for less masculine men. So, let's say she's on the pill. When she meets you, you're not a particularly masculine man, but that's fine. She comes off the pill and suddenly she's like, wow, I do not fancy you anymore. You're not my type.
Yes. Yeah, I've had
Um,
that happen in relationships. It's disturbing. Yeah,
Yeah,
listen,
it's real, but it's real. It's real,
it's the
and
thing.
yeah, and there are other studies as well. I mean, I talked about this study. I talk about this study in the book, and I've talked about it on my Substack and elsewhere. There was a study fairly recently that was done. They did MRI scans of teenage girls and women's brains on and off the pill, and they showed that actually using the contraceptive pill thins a particular area. I think it's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, front of the brain, that's associated with fear processing and emotional control. It actually thins it. They showed it with MRI scans. They showed that it atrophies that area of the brain. But what's interesting is not only the fact that area of the brain is associated with fear processing and emotional control, and that might have political knock-on effects, you could imagine. For example, I mean, women's advocacy of open border policies perhaps might be influenced by let's say, an incorrect sense of the fear of letting in people, foreigners, letting in people you don't know, letting in people who aren't like you, don't share the same values, might present a threat. But what's interesting about the study as well is that it showed that actually, I think if teenage girls go on the pill and then come off after a certain age, the thinning doesn't go away.
Mm,
So obviously, the brain is developing through childhood, through teenage years. They often say your brain isn't fully formed until you're about 25. Well, if you interfere in the proper development of the brain, of the female brain, by taking the contraceptive pill during teenage years, it's irreversible. It actually
right.
has
There's a full.
an irreversible structural effect on the brain, which is
All right.
which is crazy. And we're only just learning this after decades and decades since the 1950s of giving women the
Right. And it's
contraceptive
in the
pill.
water supply as well. So it's not
Yeah.
just the women. Listen, I've got an egg with me today. And I've never eaten a raw egg. And I said, if this guy's convincing, I'm going to slurp. What's the verb? What's the verb to
Slonk
eating?
to slonk.
I'm going to schlonk this raw egg at the end of the interview if he convinces me about all this stuff. So it may even be a confusing term, the raw egg nationalist. People are very scared of nationalism. Sort of, it
They
seems like
are.
we've been living in the sort of hypervigilance of World War II.
Mm,
It's like I sometimes imagine what a world would be like if the 30 Years' War defined how we think about good and evil, or some other
mm,
historical period,
sure.
the plague, or some other sort of
Mm,
period of difficulty and stress. And
yeah.
obviously, lots of bad things happened in World War II, and there's certainly evil things were done that we don't want to replicate. And it seems to it's coming to the end of the era where it defines things. I spoke to
Mm,
a boomer who I love, an old man, a boomer who I love last night in the States, and he was saying sort of the latest guy, is Mustache Man. I'll say that for YouTube. It's the Nazis, right? And I was like,
mm,
well, I don't necessarily like Trump myself. I think he's a bit of a narcissist, but I don't think it's World War II. This sort of
no,
grasping for that as the
no.
moral ground.
Mm,
And what would a sort of healthy boundaried nationalism look like? Essentially, you were talking about relationship to boundaries. That's something
mm,
coaches are big on. That's something psychologists and therapists are big on.
mm.
It strikes me that a sort of healthy nationalism is really just looking at our relationship to boundaries in a healthy way. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, I would say that. I mean, there's a very funny 4chan green text, or a very famous 4chan green text. That's a post from 4chan, which is an image board, which basically says, look, and it's addressed to, let's say, to conservatives. It says, 99.99% of people throughout history have believed what you believe. They were far right extremists too. Like, you have history on your side. I would just say, really, look, like, we're the odd ones, which is what I was saying right at the beginning of the interview. We're the odd ones if we think that actually there's something strange about primarily caring about your family, your local community, and probably at the furthest reaches the rest of the nation. I mean, that's normal. That is normal. It's normal to have restricted boundaries for your moral consideration and your basic loyalties. That's a normal thing. And so that's really about as
It's not very radical, is it? I mean, like I'm in
no,
Slovenia. The
no.
average Slovenian would say, yeah, most people who live here are Slovenian. We share a
Mm,
language, we share an
mm,
identity, we're an extended
mm,
family. Okay, we have some
mm.
dialects and we have some people a bit more
Yeah,
Italian or a bit more
of
Croatian.
course, yeah.
But they'd basically say, and we're not anti-foreigners. People are very friendly to me as an outsider, for example. But we have a coherence, let's say,
Mm,
culturally, people have the same religion, and that leads to a level of regulation in psychological terms. People are kind of
mm,
co-regulated very
mm,
easily around
mm,
that. And it's increasingly, I'm going to London a few days, and increasingly I'm going, God, I really don't want to. And
yep.
increasingly people from North America and Northern Europe seem sort of dysregulated and strange to me the more time I spend here.
Mm,
And I wonder how much of rediscovering a sort of healthy nationalism is just being well regulated. And as you say, it's
mm.
the absolute norm in human history to have those kind of beliefs. Like every tribal people out there would have beliefs about the people and the land being linked, for example. These aren't strange notions, right?
No. No, they're not. No, they're not at all. I mean, they're fundamental. They're fundamental. And when you understand what human history looked like, I mean, the up until the agricultural revolution 10, 12,000 years ago in the Near East, humans were hunter-gatherers, and the maximum size of a human society was, or a band of hunter-gatherers was probably about 150 to 200 people max. So modern humans, they reckon, let's say 200,000 years we've been modern humans. So for 190,000 years, we've lived in bands of, let's say, a maximum size of about 150 to 200. Uh, it's actually, that's the norm. We are structured in that way. Our brains are structured to understand society, to understand the group in those terms, and now we live in nations of 100 million, 200 million, a billion, and then we live in a world of 6, 7 billion, right? I mean,
Yes,
it's
yes.
the scale of the transformation and the speed. We're still the same creatures we were.
And
We're
that's your
still the same.
basic take on food, as I understand it, right? That
Yeah,
you're
yes, exactly.
suggesting we kind of eat more or less what we evolved to eat. And that's not simple because there were many types of
Mm.
Paleolithic diet, but we
Yeah,
probably weren't
absolutely.
eating ultra processed food, and we certainly weren't.
No,
So, I mean,
no.
say more about your take on food is because talking about food in a way is really boring, right? And everyone's got an opinion and it's
Yeah.
hard to know. But it seems pretty sensible to say, hey, if we eat more or less what we evolved to
Mm.
eat, we're probably going to be healthier than if we eat corporate food products.
Yes, yeah, and there's also a very political thing about the corporate control of the food supply too. I mean, we have surrendered control of the food supply to corporations over the last 100 years, and guess what? It's made us incredibly unhealthy. And yet we're being urged to surrender yet more control, maybe total control now, to corporations for this plant-based agenda. This is something that I talk about at length. In fact, it's the subject of my last book, The Eggs Benedict Option, is about the plant-based agenda, corporate control of the food supply, how much of a disaster it's been for human
And
health.
just to be clear, I'm going to interrupt the agenda. By that, you don't mean a conspiracy. It's written
No,
down. It's government
yeah,
policy. It's
it's
WEF
UN, it's
policy.
it's
It's you.
UN policy.
So
Yeah, I mean,
this
it's
isn't your personal kind of
no,
conspiracy theory. This is pretty
absolutely
well
not.
documented that there are
Mm,
large groups of organizing people who would like us all to
mm.
be vegetarians.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Yeah, it's absolutely not a conspiracy theory, and that's something that I say in the book. But yeah, I mean, my approach to food basically, yes, is what you might call a Paleolithic approach, because humans are fundamentally still Paleolithic creatures. I mean, I think that the best book about nutrition ever written is Weston A. Price's Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which was written in published in 1939 by a dentist called Weston A. Price. He was Canadian, but he had his practice in Cleveland, Ohio, and basically he noticed that the patients that he was treating, and particularly the children, were showing increasing signs of basically a kind of structural collapse in their faces. Their mouths were full of cavities, but not only that, their faces weren't actually developing properly. So the structure of the jaw, the structure of the mouth, the cheeks, the nose, all of it was kind of giving way. And the children especially also were starting to display kind of behavioral difficulties as well, learning difficulties. And he hypothesized, Weston Price, that this was something to do with diet. This was something to do with changing diet. Now, he was writing from the sort of turn of the 20th century through the 1930s. This was a time when Americans were increasingly, for the first time, starting to consume the very first processed foods. So that's like refined wheat products, tinned goods, foods in syrup, sugar syrups, all this kind of stuff. These are like the proto-processed foods, the first factory-made foods. Uh, and so, yeah, he said, look, I think this is because diets are changing. So what does he do? Well, he's a scientifically minded man. He says, look, we need a control group. I need to compare, what's happening with diets in the Midwest and see if it is the diet. And so what he did was he traveled around the world like an anthropologist, basically. He went to all sorts of different traditional societies in the high Arctic, in Africa, the South Sea Islands, even Europe. He went to remote parts of Switzerland and remote parts of Scotland. Um, and he looked at traditional societies, small scale societies, where they were still consuming their traditional diets. And what he discovered was no, these people didn't suffer from any of the developmental problems that his patients back in Cleveland were suffering from. If traditional societies, if they consumed their traditional diets, and their traditional diets, whether you were talking about, let's say, like the Inuit or the Nua on the Nile or the Maori in New Zealand, their traditional diets were all composed of nutrient-dense animal foods, one form or another. Salmon eggs, seafood, dairy, blood, fatty cuts of meat, all these kinds of things, like eggs. These were the basis of traditional diets in these traditional societies. And I mean, his basic point is that, look, you need to build in order to be healthy, in order to have kind of what he calls perfect physical health, you need to build a diet around nutrient-dense animal foods, whether that's dairy or organ meat or whatever, depending on where you are. Um, and so that's my basic approach. My basic approach is, look, yes, you need to eat like your ancestors. And that may very well mean, if you're from a particular region of the world, and we're all from a particular region of the world, that you have to tailor your diet to what your ancestors ate. So, I mean, groups who have the longest history of consuming grains have adaptations to consuming grains that other groups don't. And that's part of the reason, for example, why certain groups who have only just recently been introduced to Western high grain diets have enormous, enormous obesity levels. I'm talking about particularly like groups in the South Seas. That's one of the reasons why Fijians and South Sea Islanders have some of the highest rates of obesity in the world,
Yep.
because they've adopted a Western high grain diet and their bodies just aren't adapted to it. But if they ate their traditional diet, if they ate the kind of diet that Weston A. Price described when he visited the area, they would be healthy. And it's true
Okay.
also, it's also true of sub-Saharan Africans. I mean, it's been noted, for example, that sub-Saharan Africans to migrants to Europe have massively, massively increased rates of schizophrenia and mental diseases. And it's postulated that that has something to do with gluten intolerance,
Yeah,
which
interesting.
is, yeah,
Interesting.
there's a very interesting paper that I would recommend all viewers look up. You can read it for free online. It's called Bread and Other Edible Agents of Mental Disease. And it's about
Wow.
It's about the relationship between gluten intolerance and mental disease.
I
And
won't show
it's
that to the Italian I live with. She won't be very happy. That's a soul food. Listen, Charles, I want to before we wrap up, let's do some
Mm,
really practical things here. So
sure.
I find that a lot of people, there's so much advice out there. When I
Yeah.
started looking into testosterone, I was amazed by how many things were bad for it. And I
Mm,
didn't know where was the like 80-20 rule. So what would be your
mm,
sort of like top tips for anyone who wants to just generally be healthy and generally
mm.
improve their testosterone levels?
Okay, so yeah, so big things. Diet. So cut out processed foods. Adopt a diet that is built around nutrient-dense animal foods, if you can. So organ meat, fatty cuts of meat, eggs, high quality seafood, dairy, that kind of stuff. Build your diet primarily around those things. That will definitely increase your testosterone. It will benefit your hormonal balance whether you are male or female. Um, Exercise, of course. Exercise is the big thing, and if you're a man and you want to improve your testosterone, that means lifting weights. But just generally, as a point, if you are overweight, your hormonal balance will suffer. So losing weight is a good thing. So even if you don't lift weights, if you cycle, whatever, get moving, shift your excess body weight, and if you want to increase your testosterone, build some muscle. Here's a third thing actually that's very very that's neglected actually. I think is sleep.
Mm, mm.
Sleep is incredibly important, and I wang on a lot about sleep because actually, just by improving your sleep, you can work wonders for your hormones and your health. The majority of a man's testosterone is produced at night during sleep, and so if your sleep is disturbed, your testosterone production is disturbed, and they actually reckon that that is the reason why male testosterone levels decrease as men get older, because actually it's been well documented that older people sleep worse than younger people for whatever reason.
Apnea and different issues like
Mm.
that. Yeah, that's been a challenge
So
for
it's
me.
not so it's not necessarily that just when you get older, like your endocrine system
Right.
breaks down. It's also that actually you're not sleeping, so you're not creating an optimal environment for the production of hormones in the first place. There's one study that shows that actually if an older man, let's say like a 60 plus man, doubles his sleep from 4 hours to 8 hours, he doubles his testosterone. I mean,
Wow.
it's that stunning. It's that significant of an effect. And then the fourth thing, so I'm going to give you four things. The fourth thing is to minimize your exposure to harmful toxic chemicals. So that means plasticizers, these chemicals that are in personal care products, pesticides, herbicides. It's simple things like, for example, reduce your reliance on plastic. You can't totally eliminate your reliance on plastics because we live in a plastic world, but you know, reduce your reliance on plastics as much as possible. Don't drink from plastic water bottles. Don't buy processed food because that's all wrapped in plastic and contaminated with plastic chemicals and microplastics. Filter your water if you can. Reduce your reliance on personal care products, deodorants, fragrances, etc. Use a tallow soap rather than
Yeah.
a highly fragranced supermarket soap, that kind of thing. Um, yeah, and I mean those four things. If you can do those four things, or even three of them, then I can guarantee that in a relatively short period of time, you can actually transform your health and feel better. You don't need to be doing, I mean, there are esoteric things and there are hacks that you can do and unusual things that you can do, but actually those are the fundamentals. And if you get the fundamentals right, if you're unhealthy, you'll end up being far healthier than you were before. So
Right.
yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
do
You
that,
can't
do
be.
those four things.
It's difficult to be perfect with any of these things, but I just
Mm,
found like little changes, like okay, really prioritizing sleep, replacing my
yes.
plastic bottle for the gym with a glass one. It's just
Mm,
replacing when my soap run out, getting a sort of more natural. So, just a few little changes over
mm.
time. Listen, I owe you an egg. I think
Yeah,
I
do
think
it.
you've. So I've never eaten a raw egg before. So this is a Slovenian organic, relatively
Wonderful.
locally sourced egg. So I'm probably not going
Wonderful.
to die of salmonella.
You'll be
Uh,
fine.
what do I do? I literally have no idea. I just crack it and
Just crack it and knock it back like you're Rocky.
do I? And I don't like mix it up or anything. I just go for it.
No, just go for it.
All
Just
right.
go
While
for it.
I'm doing that, tell people where to find you on the internet.
Okie doke. Good man, down the hatch. So you can find me on Twitter, Raw Egg Nationalist. My handle is unfortunately Baby Gravy 9. I got a website, rawegnationalist.com. My Substack is rawegstack.com. Uh, and my new book, The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity, is coming out via Passage Press. That's passage.press is the website. I think you can pre-order it now, but it's definitely coming out next month. So yeah, so I mean, if you want, really, the best place to go is my Twitter, babygravy9. That's where you'll see everything advertised there, all updates, etc. And subscribe to my Substack, rawegstack.com.
That's, you know what? I was expecting that to be disgusting. I was expecting it to be like giving Satan a blowjob, but it wasn't that bad. It really wasn't that bad. I might do that for breakfast next time I'm in a hurry and can't be asked to cook
Yeah,
breakfast.
it's a great way to get high quality nutrition quickly, and also you can do what bodybuilders used to do. You can make like a shake, so raw milk, cream in equal proportion, half and half, little bit of honey and some eggs, whisk it up, and basically it's custard. And then you're just drinking raw custard.
Charles, I can see why Wikipedia is so worried about you giving people
I know.
custard recipes. I can see why
Yeah,
they're afraid. So, Raw Egg Nationalist, thank you so much for joining us today.
it was a real pleasure. Thank you, Mark.